Welcome to this introduction to fantasy. The association of fantasy with imagination and subconscious desires has made it a difficult area to articulate and define, but if we're going to be writing in this genre, it makes sense for us to try and understand it. So I've prepared this animation to tackle the question, what is fantasy? And in doing so, we will attempt to discern the wood from the trees. Early definitions of fantasy are concerned with what it is not. It is not realism, therefore it is escapism. Fantasy is what could not have happened, what cannot exist. In The Game of the Impossible, a rhetoric of fantasy, William R. Irwin states that a fantasy is a story based on and controlled by an overt violation of what is generally accepted as possibility. So it is what cannot be, thus it is a violation of reality. One thing we can say with absolute certainty is that fantasy involves world building. And this brings us to high and low fantasy, and the kind of worlds that populate the genre. Firstly, it is important to note that these terms do not denote good and bad fantasy, but two different types of fantasy, realised through different types of worlds. According to Boyer et al., there are two principal criteria for fantasy. Number one, non-rational phenomena, and number two, setting. Both of these are interrelated, since the non-rational phenomena take place in the created world. The worlds of high fantasy are composed of 1. Non-rational phenomena that is explained through magic and or gods, and is 2. Set in a distinct world apart from our own, a secondary world like Middle-earth, Earthsea and Westeros. Conversely, the worlds of low fantasy are composed of 1. Non-rational phenomena that is not explained via gods, magic or anything else, and is 2. Set in this world, the primary world, within which gods and fairies no longer, alas, walk. Interestingly, low fantasy has the power to shock and horrify precisely because it gives us no explanation. In general, when we talk about fantasy, we're probably talking about high fantasy. Writers of high fantasy approach their primary worlds in one of 3 ways. 1. They ignore the primary world and introduce readers to the secondary world immediately, like in Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea. There is no connection to our world, no portals to pass through. 2. The secondary world is set in a more direct relationship to the primary world, like Narnia. We can directly compare the secondary world with our world, and this may feature differences in how time passes. These relationships tend to feature portals or rabbit holes. 3. The world within a world. There are no portals. The secondary world is in a particular location in the primary world, like Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, and Hogwarts. Beyond fantasy's solar system, the genre is generally apparent in 4 main areas. 1. Character. 2. Plot. 3. Action. And 4. Language. And we're going to look at each in turn. Number 1. Character. Character in fantasy is frequently generalised or idealised, but, as in myth, the concept and quality of the hero are of great importance. Modern fantasy has diverged into 2 complementary but distinct thematic branches, generating 2 distinct types of hero, 1 religious and 2 secular. Tolkien can clearly be seen to be representative of the first, where William Morris may represent the second, and these 2 authors have set the course for the ongoing stream of fantasy. Tolkien's hero, the religious hero, is dislocated in a fallen world, charged to renounce the temptation of human power, surrounded by others clearly different to himself and, very sadly for him, who must remain distant, finding hope in creating an immortal written word and sailing to an eternity of peace with the gods. This hero is religious and painfully alien, becoming whole by the grace of an outside source. Morris's hero, the secular hero, is rooted to human community, charged to become his own god, needing to explore individual and psychological potential in relationship to the other of eternity, history and sexuality. This hero is secular and pre-existential, with the ability to become whole in commitment to spouse and community. Regardless of exactly how we draw the lines of influence in our emerging contemporary tradition, Morris and Tolkien have provided the horizontal and vertical axis on which the modern fantasy hero can be plotted. Let us not forget that both their fantasies and, indeed, modern fantasy is rooted in ancient myths, mysticism, folklore, fairy tale and romance. Heroes and kings in fantasy tend to be this because of lineage and virtue and a utopian idyll of preordained rights. Robert E. Howard reversed this path to the throne by choosing a brute for his hero and later his king in Conan the Barbarian, thereby creating a model of barbaric supermen for heroic fantasy, a path to power through muscle and might, with little affirmation of civilization or philosophy along the way. Howard was one of the strongest influences in the creation of the subgenre of fantasy known as sword and sorcery. He was not the first to use this model of the beefy hero, but his influence has exerted a lasting impression. We may even accredit Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan of the Apes to this influence. Like Morris and Tolkien, Howard acknowledges a deep affiliation with the distant past. Unlike Morris and Tolkien, he emphasises a brutal and gruesome violence. Conan represents a survival and kingship of the fittest. In many ways, it is a fantasy of liberation, though if Conan were to be placed anywhere, it would be in the secular fantasy. Number 2, plot. Plot is a central quality of fantasy and often evokes myths, symbols, archetypes, and we strayed into this area with characters. It is interesting to note that the creation of fantasy does begin with research into existing mythology. Most fantasy plots tend to be quests, overcoming the monster, or voyage and return, and we find these plots now are myths, legends and fairy tales. This lends a kind of authenticity or believability to our fantasy that enables the reader to suspend their disbelief. Number 3, action. Action usually includes confrontation with large-scale evil forces. A plot conflict seen in terms not of individual conflict, but of a dialectic of good and evil. This is still prevalent in modern fantasy, though questions might be raised as to the nature of the good and evil, and characters that may seem to be evil can also do good, or at least be understood. Number 4, language. The language of fantasy is often a created artifice, a consciously crafted, elevated style using language wrenched and reworked into an artificial beauty all its own, as distinct from prosaic speech as fantasy is from mundane reality. This artifice, though, can serve to alert the reader to the language of the book. It both creates a vivid realisation of an imagined world and acknowledges what this world is not. Well, those are the elements of fantasy, but what does fantasy do for us? As the unreal is set against the real, it can tell us a lot about this real cultural order in which we exist. The fantastic interrogates the real by its difference. So perhaps more so than in any other genre, it does make sense to think about what fantasy is saying about its cultural context. This does not make the genre revolutionary, but it does mean that it undermines notions of the real. So the roots of literary fantasy have a subversive function. As the prevailing notion of reality alters, so too must the fantastical unreality. So fantasy can only really remain relevant if it is held in relation to contemporary issues and concerns. And achieving this has been one of the biggest difficulties for fantasy as a genre. Tolkien's Middle-earth was both a blessing and a curse. In the mid-1950s, Tolkien breathed new life into fantasy with The Lord of the Rings. As an academic, he also brought a weight of literary research to the text, making it impossible to simply dismiss. For perhaps the first time, the genre had to be taken seriously. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien provided us with one of the earliest, clearest, and most influential descriptions of fantasy. He said that because fantasy is able to transcend the limitations of reality, it is not a lower but a higher form of art, indeed, the most nearly pure form, and so the most potent. He argued that fantasy does not avoid the actual, but rather provides a more complete understanding as well as recovery and consolation. Fantasy helps us to clean our windows, so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. We laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring them cease to look at them. To escape, one must first be liberated, and this was the great gift of fantasy to us all, according to Tolkien. In fantasy, we could escape from hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, death, this last being the oldest, deepest desire, the great escape, the escape from death. Tolkien succeeded in both capturing our imagination and in giving us a kind of academic permission to be so captured. This has been the blessing of Tolkien's influence. So what of the curse? The curse has been simply this, that apart from a few, fantasy writers have been rewriting Tolkien's world ever since. This in itself is not an issue. The problem is that with Middle-earth comes the issues and concerns prevalent in the real world of the 1940s and 50s. Times have changed, but for the most part, fantasy writers did not change with them. But we can't blame it all on Tolkien. Fantasy writers are understandably, and quite rightly, fantasy readers. And they recreate what they have read. And the person who reads that recreates it again, and so on, and so forth. Fantasy, perhaps more than most other genres, suffers from this recreation. So much so, it's even been given a name, Fantasyland. But more on this in the class later. Finally, I will leave you with this quotation from Ursula K. Le Guin. I believe that maturity is not an outgrowing, but a growing up. That an adult is not a dead child, but a child who survived. I believe that all the best faculties of a mature human being exist in the child, and that if these faculties are encouraged in youth, they will act well and wisely in the adult. But if they are repressed and denied in the child, they will stunt and cripple the adult personality. And finally, I believe that one of the most deeply human and humane of these faculties is the power of imagination. Thanks for listening.